W movie review. So this is Oliver Stone's movie about George W. Bush. The title of the movie is W, like the letter W, period. But according to Wikipedia, it's supposed to be pronounced as W. So W, I don't know. This movie came out in 2008, so it's a little bit old now. This is part of my scripted review series, in which I read one of the old reviews I wrote years ago on the weblog and try and make it into a YouTube video for whatever it may or may not be worth. So, do you remember this movie? This movie came out in October 2008, and at the time it hit theaters, George W. Bush's presidency was not even over yet. His term in office didn't expire until January something. The November election hadn't even been finalized yet, hadn't even happened yet. So it gave a real sense at the time of like, oh wow, they're rolling out the hatchet jobs on his presidency, like the Hollywood biopic treatment. And his presidency hasn't even finished yet. Gave it a real sense of immediacy at the time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I didn't actually see it at that time. By the time I got around to seeing it, it was in 2009. So I had read all about it online before I got around to seeing it. There was, you may recall, before it came out, because it was Oliver Stone, and because Oliver Stone has a bit of a reputation for doing these polemical movies, there was a big expectation that this was just going to be a full onslaught against George W. Bush. And then when the reviews came out, the review says actually it's not so anti-Bush as you would expect. There are some jabs here and there, but it's overall a much more sympathetic portrayal of Bush than people were expecting it would be. Or it was a movie that was much more interested in the human story of George W. Bush instead of the political angle behind it. By the time I got around to seeing the movie, about a year later, I had read all those reviews, and so I was prepared for what I was going to see. Oliver Stone, it's also worth mentioning. I like Oliver Stone, and I think he's interested in a lot of the same areas I'm interested in. Like he does movies on subjects that I would generally be interested in. But that being said, in my opinion, his movies can be hit and miss. Some of them can be really difficult to sit through. I think the worst example is Alexander the Great, which again was a subject I was actually quite interested in. I was I've always been an ancient history buff, so I thought, all right, big Hollywood Alexander the Great movie, and it was just very difficult to sit through. And some of his other movies have been a little bit long and self-indulgent as well. So I was worried a little bit about that with this movie, but I saw it, and I have to say I was thoroughly entertained. I was just glued to the TV the whole time that this was on. All the dialogue, all the scenes, I just thought the whole thing was fascinating. And maybe some of that was because of the immediacy of the time. I mean, even by the time I got around to seeing it, all of George W. Bush's presidency was very fresh in the mind. I thought Josh Brolin did a great job in this movie. Josh Brolin, I know if you go to his Wikipedia page, he's been acting all the way since the 1980s. He was in Goonies, a film I saw in the 1980s as a child. But I didn't really start to hear his name until about a couple years before this movie came out. I think No Country for Old Men was the first thing I saw that I really took notice of him in. After that, American Gangster and the Grindhouse movies, which came out shortly after, he was also in. And I thought, wow, this is an actor who it really is quite mesmerizing on screen. He's a fascinating guy to watch. So when I heard he was going to be in this movie, I thought, well, this could be quite interesting. and he does an excellent job doing it. Interestingly enough, he was a last-minute replacement for Christian Bale. Christian Bale was going to do it. Christian Bale had researched the part, but then Christian Bale didn't like the makeup tests. So Christian Bale left the project, and they got him in as a last-minute replacement. But he does a fantastic job on this, considering he's the last... I mean, I was going to say considering he's a last-minute replacement, but... He does a fantastic job on this, full stop. You would never know he was a last-minute replacement. The film is not a liberal hack job against George W. Bush. There are a few jibes thrown in there, but it's an almost sympathetic view of a tragic life. It's actually both politics and personal tragedy, and that's what makes the film so engaging. Now, when I first saw this film, I was thinking that it reminded me a little bit of the story of King Henry V from Shakespeare. I had taken a couple Shakespeare classes in college, and I was thinking, I didn't know if that was intentional or not, but it seemed like those overtones were there. I have since then read some interviews with Oliver Stone where he said, I was 100% trying to do a King Henry V thing. That was what I was trying to do in these movies. Now, if you're not familiar, Shakespeare had a series of 4 history plays. Richard II, King Henry IV Part 1, King Henry IV Part 2, and King Henry V, which charted kind of the, well, not so much the first one, Richard II, but the last 3 definitely, charted the growth of the character of King Henry V. And the first 2, the King Henry IV Part 1 and King Henry IV Part 2, King Henry IV is king, and Henry V is just prince at that time. They call him Prince Hale in the plays. And he is expected to become king after his father, but he has no interest in being taking on the serious business of statecraft. And instead he's out at the tavern drinking and getting into mischief with his friends. But then, when the time comes for him to actually be king, then he assumes the mantle of adulthood and he starts taking things seriously. And he ends up being one of England's greatest kings and leading them to glorious battle in France and all this stuff. And so the progression from somebody who was having a very irresponsible youth to becoming a responsible adult. Now, that's not all Oliver Stone. That is actually somewhat the real-life biography of George W. Bush. But it is played up in this movie to have King Henry V overtones. And again, it's something I thought I noticed when I was seeing the movie, and it's something that Oliver Stone later confirmed in other interviews. The interesting thing about the parallel maybe with King Henry V is... as is portrayed in Shakespeare, somebody who had an irresponsible youth drinking a lot, then goes on to become one of England's greatest kings. Whereas George W. Bush has an irresponsible youth, shapes up his act, gets responsible, and then goes on to become one of America's worst presidents. Sorry, you may detect a liberal bias in there. I'm a liberal, yeah. In my opinion, goes on to become one of America's worst presidents. I think it's fair to say that's Oliver Stone's bias as well. So in that respect, it's maybe similar to Stone's previous film, Nixon. Both are films of which the protagonist gains the greatest office in the land, gets the highest honor you could have in this world. And then instead of it making them into a great person, they leave the office disgraced and completely ruined. At least their reputation completely ruined. Although, I was thinking about it, and I thought, I wonder though, if there's really that much difference between George W. Bush and King Henry V, because King Henry V was considered a glorious king in his day because he led England to victory against France. But, you know, maybe if you had swapped time periods with them, and, you know, King Henry V had been like a 21st century king, then people would have been like, oh, this awful King Henry V, he got us into this terrible war with France, and we didn't need to do it, and we should have just stayed out of it, and all that needless loss of life. Yeah, you know, people didn't say that at the time, or maybe they did, but that's not how the history was written. You know, maybe if George W. Bush had lived 500 years ago, and he had gotten England into a war in which he'd achieved some victories. I mean, you see what I'm saying, right? The fact that King Henry V was remembered as such a great king was because of his achievements in war, but maybe that's really not that great. And maybe he's not that different from George W. Bush. Anyways, this film, when it came out, and probably still to this day, had people all over the internet talking about how accurate it was. Partly because George W. Bush was such a polarizing figure before this film even came out, and partly because Oliver Stone had a reputation before this film even came out. I did a little bit of internet research, and I think most of the film largely checks out, in my opinion. There are some fictional scenes that Oliver Stone uses to tie things together, but you know, that's what you do in a biopic. There was an interesting article I came across in Slate magazine by a guy named Timothy Noah, which I'll link to in the description down below, which talks about the historical accuracy behind this movie, and he makes the interesting point that very often in this movie, the scenes that you think are fictional, the scenes that you think, oh, okay, that's just Oliver Stone doing his Hollywood type thing, those are actually the scenes that come from real life. I think the best example he gives is when George W. Bush comes home drunk one night and his father is scolding him like, well, why are you getting drunk? You'll never amount to anything. And George W. Bush says, all right, you want to go, old man? You and me, mano a mano, will fight right here. And you think, oh, that's just Hollywood drama. But that actually comes from a biography of George W. Bush. So that's actually taken from a source. As with a lot of the details in this movie, or the scenes in this movie that you think are too dramatic to be real life. Now, as a lot of liberals have pointed out, including Timothy Noah, who I just mentioned, this film is not nearly as hard on George W. Bush as it could be. There are numerous scandals in his administration, or that he was involved with himself, that the film just doesn't touch on. But then again, it is a film, and I think Oliver Stone's movie Nixon was brilliant, but it was too long, in my opinion. It was a little bit difficult to sit through. I like Nixon, but Nixon, in my opinion, is best if you rent it and then you pause it halfway through and you watch it over 2 nights. It's too much to sit through all at once, in my opinion. George W. Bush on the, the movie about George W. Bush is much more watchable because it's just slightly over 2 hours. So I think that's a trade-off. If you were to include all the terrible scandals, then the movie would have just been way too long. But yeah, as people have pointed out, there was so much interesting stuff or chaos behind the scenes of his administration that they could have put in here, stuff that seems like it was just tailor-made for a Hollywood movie that didn't get put in. Also, Oliver Stone and this movie give George W. Bush the benefit of the doubt most of the time by assuming his good intentions. I would not have been so generous had I been writing it. I've got a lot more pessimistic view of his intentions. But then the end of this movie, where they play Bob Dylan's With God on Our Side over the ending credits, is just devastating. I mean, there's no... They don't need to explicitly connect the dots with what they're trying to say. All they need to do is just play that song and you get it completely. And that's just the best critique of George W. Bush's administration I think you could have. Now, I think this film, again, this film was released before the presidency even finished. It's not going to be the final version. Maybe 20 years from now, somebody will do a new biopic on George W. Bush, and it'll take advantage of all the books that have come out in the years since then. And it'll be interesting to see what filmmakers do in the future. But I think this movie, as it was, considering that it came out before his presidency even finished, and maybe even was a bit of a rush job to get this released before the presidency even finished, was all right for what it was. Yeah, I'll just finish it here.